Okay, so the module today consists of 5 different parts. And the 5 parts, there's 5 sessions. And I'll be presenting the first couple. Session 1 is Watershed Hazards in a Changing Climate. The next part is Understanding Risks. I'm going to introduce Session 3, which is Managing Risk Through Adaptation. And I'll just introduce that, and then Kristen is going to take over and talk quite a bit about natural approaches to adaptation. The next part is Session 4, where we'll look at least one approach for assessing the value of adaptation strategies. And then Kristen is going to finish off with some thoughts on effective communication. I would like to mention, though, that watershed management, it's a very broad subject. And as we put this program together, there's really a lot of different aspects to think about. And some of the strategies that we talk about are quite specific to a particular type of hazard. And so I'd like you to sort of think about, as we go through this process, how the particular idea that we're presenting might be more widely applicable to some of the things that you are involved in. And so let's start with Session 1, Watershed Hazards in a Changing Climate. And what are some of the hazards? Well, one of the first hazards I'd like to talk about is something that's not even directly relevant or applicable to Alberta, but I think as Canadians, it is important to us. And that's thinking about hazards as it relates to our coasts. And coastal flood hazard is really related to when a combination of different events comes together. And the events that come together are the tide, so we have high tide levels, we have storm surges, and then if we have a significant storm and the waves contribute to that, is when these 3 factors come together, and that's when the worst flood hazards exist on the coast. In the context of climate change, we know that sea levels are rising. It's inevitable. And the only question really with sea level rise is how quickly it's happening. So we have to think about sort of the time frame and how far we're going to look out. But in BC at the moment, we're using an estimate of 1 meter of sea level rise by the year 2100 and 2 meters of sea level rise by the year 2200. So when all of these factors come together, there's a significant coastal flood hazard. Now, that's, like I said, not relevant to Alberta necessarily. So let's move on to what is. And so if we look at the top 2 slides, in particular, river floods or riverine floods, which is also referred to as fluvial types of flooding. What we can say about riverine floodings is that the timing of the floods is likely to change. So with the freshet-dominated flood, the flood peak is likely to move earlier in the year. And the reason for that is because the climate is warming, more of precipitation that occurs in the winter is falling as rain rather than snow, or there can be at least a transition towards that. And then just the warmer temperatures mean that the melt moves earlier. So if you ask me the question whether fluvial or riverine floods are going to get worse or whether the magnitude is going to increase with climate change, I would be uncertain as to the answer. I would have to ask you for more information. What is the nature of the watershed? Is it freshet dominated? What is the size of the watershed? Is it large? Is it small? And so I'd need a lot of that type of information. And then what I could tell you is that we have to do more investigation, site-specific investigation to answer that question. One thing I can say is that climate change tends to increase variability. And with increased variability, that tends to increase extremes. So just the annual variability of a larger event or a smaller event, when you do the frequency analysis on that, it would tend to say that events will get worse into the future. But I think that's a very site-specific issue about riverine floods. It's a little more clear actually on pluvial type of floods. So pluvial floods are extreme precipitation. This is typically short duration rainfall or shorter duration rainfall that is applicable to smaller catchments and watersheds. And this type of flooding is extremely critical in terms of something that we should be concerned about, largely because of where it occurs. Because it tends to occur in smaller catchments, smaller watersheds, and quite often that means urbanized watersheds. So the exposure and the value of the assets in the watersheds, including people, is very vulnerable to this type of event. Managing this type of hazard is to provide adequately sized storm drainage systems, the pipe collection systems, referred to as a minor system, and then also ensuring that there's proper overland flow paths to manage the water and to get it to the receiving water body safely. We do know that this type of hazard is increasing. And the reason we know it's increasing is because of a warming climate. And there's an equation called the Clapeyron equation that says for every 1 degree warming in the atmosphere can hold 7% more rainfall, or I should say 7% more water vapor. So with that 7% increase in water vapor in the atmosphere, when the meteorological conditions are right, or maybe when the meteorological conditions are wrong, that excess precipitation can fall as extreme rainfall and cause this type of flooding. The next type of hazard is ice jamming, so bottom middle. And there's two types of ice jamming, or two main categories that occurs during freeze up. So it's sort of early season ice jamming, and then breakup. So it's late season ice jamming. Ice jamming, it's very site specific. And so to answer the question as to whether it's getting better or worse, I think that really requires a specific site-specific investigation. Ice jamming tends to occur in known locations, but those known locations might get better or worse depending on the specific conditions, the thermal environment. And there's some areas with climate change that maybe historically have not had problems that might start to have problems, and vice versa. Maybe some of the areas that have had problems maybe will be less so in the future. But that's very site specific, and I will leave it at that. Drought, on the other hand, is quite concerning when we look towards future climate. So the first thing we think of with drought is extended dry spells. And that is true, that it's a core reason for drought, and particularly as we look back on the paleo record and seeing that there have been very long extended dry spells in the past. And we obviously have to try to understand what future climate holds in terms of drought. As I mentioned before, we know temperature is increasing. So another thing we know with a high level of certainty is that evapotranspiration will increase. And with increased evapotranspiration, the soil moisture will decrease. So there will be increased water demand as a impact of decreased soil moisture. The other thing that aligns negatively with drought is that, as I mentioned previously with riverine flooding, the freshet peak is expected to move earlier. And with an earlier freshet peak and receding glaciers, some of the water that would otherwise be available to us in late summer and early fall will have already passed through the system and is no longer available. So all of these things transpire to create concern on the drought spectrum, drought side of the equation. This is a quote that I pulled from Bob Sanford. It might be paraphrased a little bit, but it's the right point, is that there's no reservoir large enough to hold all the water that nature provides for free in the form of snow and ice. And so if we lose this resource, if this resource becomes less available to us, this has a huge impact on water availability for prairie provinces. Quite often, flood hazards don't occur in isolation. They are exacerbated when different events conspire together and combine together. And so this graphic is not intended to be a Venn diagram of how the interactions can occur, but to make the point that all kinds of interactions are possible. In the case of, like I said, coastal storm surge, when you have elevated coastal conditions, the rivers back up inland. That's not necessarily applicable to Alberta, but the same thing happens with lakes and receiving waters. So if your river is in flood and you have a extreme rainfall event, the water has an inability to drain to the river because of the elevated water levels. Ice jams would have the same effect. Even these bubbles interact with each other. For example, in the case of fluvial or rivers, if you have a confluence of two rivers, if the flood wave on one passes before the other one, they're not necessarily additive. And so the impact would be less. But if those two flood waves come down concurrently, they are additive and they'll have a compounding negative impact. So there's all kinds of interactions that happen in terms of compound event interactions. I haven't mentioned a number of other different types of hazards as well, although a couple show up in this graphic. So debris floods and debris flows. Other hazards that are partly or maybe largely man-made includes things like potential for dam breach or dike breach. And so there are a whole variety of different hazards that we have to think about. And so I've touched on some of them. Maybe I've touched on most of them now. I want to digress just a little bit and answer the question, what is a watershed? Which sounds like a really straightforward question, but I think sometimes there is misunderstanding as to what a watershed is. And so, and part of the reason is because a watershed is based on your point of interest. So for example, in this watershed of the Saskatchewan River Basin, if my point of interest is the Saskatchewan River Delta just upstream of Lake Winnipeg, then the entire watershed is, including the North Saskatchewan River and the South Saskatchewan River, is part of the watershed. But if, for example, I wanted to know how much water was going underneath the low-level bridge at Edmonton, my new point of interest is Edmonton. So the watershed is just that portion of the watershed upstream of Edmonton. So you can see that it's sort of a moving target, and you can be using the same word, but it has a different meaning. So it's really just about your point of interest. And of course, the watershed itself is defined by the height of land. So in the very left-hand side of the image, the black squiggly line representing the border between BC and Alberta just happens to be the height of land. So that defines the watershed. And a drop of water that falls on the left of that line is going to go towards BC. And the drop of water that falls on the right side is going to go towards the South or North Saskatchewan River and is therefore part of the watershed. What a watershed is not is something that is defined by jurisdictional boundaries. So on the right-hand side of the screen where I have the red circle, that is also the border between Alberta and BC, but in the northern portions where the border is no longer defined on a watershed basis or the height of land, so there's more watershed within BC that's contributing to the Peace River Basin in this case. And so this does not define a watershed. We do talk about sub-watersheds as well. So sub-watersheds are just breaking up your study area into smaller manageable chunks. So within the Peace River image, those are sub-watersheds, even though the entire, the image in its entirety is not the full watershed. Okay, so how is climate change affecting watershed hazards? Well, this might be the disappointing part of my presentation because I'm actually not going to necessarily answer that question, not directly anyways. And the reason for that is because it's a very complex question. It would have nuanced answers. I would need more information. So it's really just kind of it's not reasonable to answer that question, but what is reasonable is to talk about how we would go about answering that question. And that's what I want to focus on for the next part of the session one. So one of the critical items is the idea of non-stationarity. And this is really critical because what it's referring to is that the mechanisms that cause hazards are fundamentally changing. Okay, so climate change is causing changes in our climate, but along the way, some of those fundamental things are actually changing it, making a change in the mechanism that caused the hazard in the first place. And I'll give you some examples of that. So for example, the phase of winter precipitation. If, let's picture a smaller, lower elevation watershed where the peak of the runoff has traditionally occurred from snowmelt and the freshet condition. So as we look forward in time and that watershed, the winter precipitation, rather than coming down as snow and accumulating and then melting, if actually it starts to transition to a rain-dominated system so that that snowpack doesn't exist and it's just a straight, the precipitation falls as rain and runs off immediately, it's a completely different mechanism. We're no longer going to see the peak of the freshet in that example. We're going to see more of a continuous cyclical runoff during the winter period. So that's a fundamental change in the mechanism. Loss of glaciers is another example, a similar example, that if the glaciers recede and ultimately the glaciers are lost, you no longer have that base flow that carries into the summer and early fall. And so it's a loss of base flow water into the receiving water courses. Atmospheric rivers is another one. I don't know if you are familiar with this term, but what it is it's also referred to as the Pineapple Express, which is storms that originate in the South Pacific and sort of travel through the Hawaiian Islands area and right up into the north coast of North America and cause really intense rainfall from all the moisture that is picked up along the way. And this is a phenomenon that's increasing in strength, severity, and frequency. And once again, it's a fundamental change. So the reason this is important is because it means that our historical records are no longer valid to predict future events. In the past, we were lucky in a way because we are able to take a historical record, something that was actually measured, whether it's flow in a river or some other parameter that we could collect a long-term record of. And then we could complete an extreme value analysis on that information to predict a return period, or what I like to use as the term annual exceedance probability. Those two terms are sort of interchangeable, one being the inverse of the other. So that's how we could do it in the past, but that's no longer valid if we have changing mechanisms that are driving the hazard in the first place. So if that's the case, then we must rely on predictive models to estimate future conditions. And that's a really important point. This slide is very important because we're saying that we can no longer rely on historical records. And if we cannot do that, then we must rely on predictive models. Okay, so you're going to see this slide a few times through the presentation, and it's really taking us through the steps of what that actually means when we say we must model. So we're going to start off with global climate modeling. We're going to work our way to the right in the subsequent slides. So what is a global climate model? A global climate model is, it consists of two parts. It includes the atmospheric model. So the atmospheric model is represented by the gray grids. So it's a vertical, it's a three-dimensional grid that models the atmosphere, and then it creates a grid across the surface of the Earth, but representing the atmosphere. And so that's the atmospheric portion of the model. But modern GCMs also include the land surface model. So there's also a representation of the Earth's surface, the oceans, and other water bodies that is really a hydrological model, a somewhat maybe simplified hydrological model, or maybe a better way to say that is a coarse hydrological model that is representing and simulating the exchange of water and energy fluxes on the Earth's surface and between the Earth's surface, the oceans, and the atmosphere. So, and historically, I believe global climate models were sometimes referred to as global circulation models. So the global circulation model really referred to that part A, which is the atmospheric portion of the model. As GCMs became more sophisticated and the land surface model was incorporated into these models. So I think that the term more often used now is global climate model to represent the fact that it's modeling both those components. When we model a GCM, or when we're trying to understand the impact of climate change, we need to define two things. One is the RCPs, well, maybe more than two things, but two important things are the RCP selection. So as you can see on this image, on the left-hand side, we're looking at a very optimistic view of future emissions, which is an RCP, or representative concentration pathway of 2.6. And on the right-hand side of the image is a pessimistic view of emissions in the future, which is an RCP 8.5. So those are two kind of bounding limits. But whenever a watershed manager wants to assess impacts on a watershed, one of the first things that needs to be done is to decide on what RCP is going to be used for the assessment. The other thing is the time horizon. Do we care whether do we want to be looking out 20 years or 50 years, 100 years? What is the time horizon? So it's very important to define those two things. When we look at these images, though, and ask ourselves the question, as a watershed manager, to answer watershed management questions, what does this tell us? What can we do with it? And I think the answer to that is not very much. It tells us trends. It tells us really good, great, valuable information, but what do we do with it? Part of the reason that it doesn't tell us very much is because it's quite coarse. It doesn't really speak to the scale of most watersheds that we want to look at and assess. It's something that is much more large scale in nature and not refined enough for the questions we want to answer. So that means we have to look at a more refined. We have to dig deeper to start answering the questions that we might be asking as a watershed manager. And to do that, we have to downscale the global climate model. We have to bring it down to a scale that can start representing the features that we're trying to assess. And I'll give you this image. I recognize it's not very legible, but it's a very informative image. So I kept it in the slideshow for that reason. And To help you along a little bit, underneath the black grid is Lethbridge, and at the top above the black grids is Red Deer. So that gives you a little bit of sense of the scale. The black grids represent the GCM. So they're typically in something like the 150 kilometer type of grid size or greater. That's quite typical of a GCM to be of that sort of scale. But you can recognize, or you should recognize, that in the context of most watersheds, that would be very coarse. We can't represent the physical features within the watershed, whether it's mountainous areas, whether it's lake systems, whether it's urban environments. It's just very, very coarse and would really have to average a lot of different physical parameters, geophysical parameters, in order to represent that space well. So the downscaling, the spatial downscaling, is represented by the blue boxes, and quite typically the spatial downscaling might create a size something like 30 kilometers or so or greater, and that would be quite typical of a downscaling project to start representing the system more at a watershed scale. And if you think about that kind of scale, and you know, it maybe would cover the entire city of Calgary in a single grid box. It's still relatively coarse, but in terms of larger watersheds, it would be quite reasonable to start representing the features of that watershed at that kind of scale. However, when we start looking at smaller watersheds and wanting to resolve issues of short duration events and start to get the refinement that we might want out of a model, represent specific features, you could go finer scale. So the red boxes represent something that would be considered sort of state of the art in terms of downscaling. And those red boxes are in the scale of maybe 2 to 3 kilometers. But something really interesting to help sort of put it in perspective, that the circular rings in this image are rainfall radar information. And you can see some of the convective types of storm cells that are occurring in there. And if you think about whether you'd be able to represent that type of storm system within any of those boxes, it's not until you get down to that red spatial resolution that you'd be able to resolve that type of phenomenon. And so you really have to look at what you're trying to represent, what you're trying to model, what you're trying to capture to determine the rate or the necessary resolution for your project. So that was spatial resolution. The other important aspect is temporal or time-based resolution. And if you look at the image on the left, which is historical precipitation for Canada, if you looked at that and you looked at your province of Alberta, you'd say, well, actually, precipitation doesn't seem to be changing very much over that close to 70-year period. So why should we be concerned about precipitation, about availability of water? We could say we're done here and walk away. But clearly that would be a wrong choice, because as you start to look closer at the temporal resolution, first of all, let's look at seasonal resolution. So in the middle image, you can see that in the winter time, there's much more precipitation expected in the future during the winter period. And that's true of the winter and spring period, that there's an expectation of increased precipitation, but more of that precipitation will be falling as rain. And as I said before, more of it will run off earlier in the year. I didn't include the image here of summer, but summer, there's not very much of a change in precipitation, maybe a slight small increase in precipitation. But the concern is that the runoff that would normally be available during summer and early fall is going to be less available because it's running off earlier. Going to the next image on the right accentuates this idea even further that rainfall patterns are changing. So this is the really short duration rainfall pattern, looking at just a 1 day or 24-hour precipitation extremes. And you can see from this that a 50-year rainfall event in, say, approximately 1990 would, or is expected to become a 20-year event by the year 2090. So that's a massive change. And similarly, if you look at a 10-year event in 1990, that's expected to become a 5-year event by the year 2090. Okay, so the temporal resolution of rainfall of your GCM and your downscaling to an RCM is very, very important. Okay, so what does this tell a watershed manager? Well, still not very much, because it tells us about the trends and what's going to happen, but there's one additional step, at least one additional step that we have to go through, and that's to now take this information and run it through a hydrological model. So the hydrological model is nothing new. We've been building these for a very, very, very long time. They're just representation of the full hydrological cycle in your watershed. So this would be a purpose-built hydrological model for the watershed that you're studying. And it would include all of the components, so precipitation, whether that precipitation falls as rain or snow, whether it accumulates or runs off, how it's routed through the river systems and stored in lakes or reservoirs, evaporation, transpiration, and the full hydrological cycle. Okay, so that is nothing new. It's very important to calibrate and to verify the models. And for those of you who were sort of wondering as we look to the future, whether the hydrometric data collection that that all provinces are currently completing provides value, I can assure you it does, because this is a critically important step with any model to make sure that the model is that the simulated results are closely replicating the observed results. And if not, it needs to be adjusted through calibration and verification. The same thing holds true in climate modeling. In the climate modeling world, it's usually referred to as bias correction. Now, there's subtle differences between bias correction and calibration, but they're similar to each other in that the idea is that when you run the simulation, if it's not replicating historical results, you need to adjust model parameters to bring it into conformance. Okay, this slide will be deja vu. It's exactly the same slide you saw prior to the last, but at the same time, it's hugely different. The reason it's different is because instead of forcing this model now with historical climate data and maybe standardized values, we are now populating the same model with future climate change projection data that we have extracted or derived from the RCM. So this hydrological model can now be forced using the gridded hydrological data from an RCM. Okay. And this is an example of one of the products that's available for water managers and hydrologists to use to do just that. So if you were to have a study watershed, you can take your gridded data, which is will provide a time series of the parameters that you want to populate your model with, whether it's temperature, precipitation, evapotranspiration, or what have you. And now you can bring this data into your hydrological model so that you can simulate future climate using a selected source of information. Okay, so after going through those processes, we finally get to the answering the questions that was asked at the beginning. Is what impact is climate change expected to have on a hazard on watershed management? And so this is an image that was developed by Anis Sachin. You can see that the baseline condition extending over about nearly a 60-year period in the dark blue is showing so it's just showing the historical results. And in the light blue, we can look at what the simulated future hydrograph would look like on the North Saskatchewan River at Edmonton. And so some of the points I had mentioned earlier, you can see the validity, or at least the where this information is derived from. We can see that the hydrographic peak from this freshet dominated system is moving earlier in the year. It's somewhat higher, so there's a significant increase in the peak flow, which would be sort of questionable before you did this modeling, because you might think that the with more runoff during the winter period, which is shown sort of through even this March, April period, you might think that that wouldn't accumulate, so wouldn't be available for runoff. But with the increased precipitation, there's also more precipitation falling, so it can have this type of effect. But maybe the most important, or at least one of the very important aspects of this hydrograph, is looking at the reduced volume of water that is available in the system as you go through the summer and early fall periods. And this is when water is in demand for agricultural purposes, recreation, environmental flows. So this is a very significant finding to look at how that can be managed into the future. So this is my final slide for session 1, and just some of the key messages include that climate change is affecting the magnitude, timing, and frequency of hazards. The fundamental mechanisms driving hazard events can be changing. So that's really the key point, is that historical records are not valid to predict future events. And so we have to rely on modeling. So hazards can be increasing, decreasing, or staying the same. Really, to evaluate that, we have to complete the modeling, and we have to evaluate the potential changes at an appropriate spatial and temporal scale. Okay, so that concludes session 1.
So the question that we're wondering today is, what are the most concerning impacts to watersheds that you've noticed or experienced?
So the next session is about understanding risk. And what is risk? Well, very simply put, it's the likelihood of an event occurring and the consequences of that event if it were to occur. I think we've all seen this, this risk table before, showing likelihood down the left-hand column and consequence across the top. And so I think from a qualitative perspective, populating this type of table is not hard, or at least something that we can sort of all address and kind of understand for a particular event, whether it's likely to happen and whether it's going to be severe consequences or not. But the question is, how do we quantify the risk? How, rather than taking a qualitative approach, how do we actually have something that we can measure and quantify and put in this table to understand how urgent or important it is to take action? So before we do that, though, it's really important. You can see that there's a number of different hazard images around the outside of this hazard, this risk table. We first have to define what hazards are we referring to, because you can enter this table with multiple hazards or a singular hazard, and where. And that's really talking about the domain of the table. And I'll give you an example of what I mean by where. I've put 2 dots in the table. And if we consider that there's a river, and the river flows through a reach that is uninhabited in a bedrock type of channel, where if and when an event occurs, it's going to have virtually no consequence. So that is represented by the blue dot on the left. It's a possible event, but the consequences are insignificant. But that same river, as it flows downstream, might now enter into a alluvial reach with low-lying banks that's heavily populated and urbanized. And so that exact same event and a different reach of the river can be on a completely different spot in this risk table because the consequences could be severe. So it's really important to define the domain that you're talking about when you assess risk. So one of the first things we need to do, I'm going to use for much of the rest of my presentations, I'm going to be using a specific example, and I'm going to be focusing on flood. And I noticed on the Menti poll that there's a large number of you that are more interested on the drought side or other hazards. So I hope some of these ideas you can sort of translate into your area of interest. I think much of it is transferable, but I just ask you to kind of consider that as we go through these slides. But using flooding as an example, we can use the hydrological model that we talked about earlier to develop a table of annual exceedance probability versus future flow. So this is necessary for us to start understanding the likelihood side of the risk equation. Okay, so this is a necessary first step. But what does this tell us? And I think the answer to that once again is not very much, because we can look at that river and we can see a particular flow going down the river, but we don't know anything about its exposure or what sort of exposure and vulnerability and consequence that it would create. So the next step in terms of a flood assessment is to complete hydraulic modeling. So the hydraulic model would need to represent the river reaches that we're looking at. It might include some sort of definition of the river through cross sections or a terrain model to represent the river and the overbank areas. And with that type of hydraulics model, we can develop this type of inundation mapping. So this is just a illustrative example of a flood inundation mapping that could occur on the Bow River in Calgary, given certain conditions. So to understand the consequence, the other side of the risk equation, we need to understand what is exposed, its vulnerability, and its value. So this type of hydraulic assessment tells us what is exposed, what is subjected to a particular flood event, but we still haven't assessed its vulnerability or value. So that's the next step. So if we now combine consequence data with the likelihood, then we are able to complete a risk analysis and complete a risk assessment for a particular area. So what do consequences look like? Well, we can take a triple bottom line approach that includes the economic, social, and environmental values. And in completing at least the flood risk assessment, um, the usually the initial focus is on the economic component of the consequences. And I think the reason for that is maybe it's the most direct and tangible. So that falls in this upper right of the circle on the right. So we can look at the economic impact of direct tangible losses to buildings and the contents of those buildings and infrastructure. Okay. There's also tangible yet indirect damages that include things like business interruptions, loss of income, and other ripple effects. And one big one that would likely fall in there is interruption to transportation corridors. On the social and environmental side, they can have very significant impacts and can be a very large part of the equation, but they're somewhat more difficult and challenging to deal with. They fall on the left-hand side of the circle, and they can be direct or indirect, but they're typically largely intangible. They're difficult to put a price tag to. So on the direct intangible side, we might have something like direct damage to environmental habitat or mortality, public safety issues, illnesses and injuries. So those are all direct and real damages, but they are more difficult to assess. And if you're in last week's meeting in economic, some of these ideas, Richard Boyd spoke to these about some of the potential methods for valuing some of these intangible damages or intangible impacts. On the social side, it tends to fall both in the intangible and indirect side. So things like psychological trauma and anxiety and exacerbation of inequalities. The point is all of these things can be included in your risk assessment. The question is how far you want to take it, because with risk assessment, you can tend to drill deeper and deeper and deeper. And so you just have to agree up front, what is the appropriate level of detail? What is the appropriate inclusion of some of these items? Should they all be quantified? Should some of them be quantified with sort of qualitative additions to each of the quantifications? So this slide brings these ideas together. We would have completed the hydrological assessment, so we know the flow rates coming down the river. We would have then completed our hydraulic model to determine the areas of the floodplain that would be exposed. And then we can start applying various methods. So the middle image on the right is showing a depth damage curve or representing a depth damage curve. So in any particular area throughout that watershed, we can look at each home and each type of home and the approximate value of that home, including commercial, industrial, institutional, multifamily types of dwellings, to assess for a particular flood depth what level, what cost of damage would be expected on that home. So both building damage and content loss. And that these same types of economic curves can be applied to other issues, some of the indirect damages such as business interruption, for example. Okay, so once those two things are overlaid, we get one dot, 1 point on the cost versus return period curve. So that one blue dot represents the net present value losses for a selected RCP and a selected time horizon. So what we're saying there, presumably that inundation map on the right was developed by running some future climate scenario with a certain RCP and time horizon to come up with that, and that translates into this one blue dot. It's referred to as a standard-based flood risk assessment, because we're just looking at one single point or one single standard, which is a 100-year return period. And we'll speak more about this in following this session. But this is a standards-based flood risk assessment because it is based just on a single annual exceedance probability. But now that we've gone through this and we've quantified the loss, it allows us to enter that same risk table in the bottom right and actually have a quantitative value or point within that curve. It's supportable from an economic perspective, or even a triple bottom line perspective of if we included that. So just to conclude this session 2 about risk assessment, risk is the product of likelihood and consequences. Modeling is required to assess the likelihood of an event under future climate. The consequences themselves include a variety of factors, including direct and indirect losses, tangible and intangible elements, but the level of inclusion of those can vary depending on any particular risk assessment. And then risk can be quantified for a particular magnitude event. Okay, so that is the conclusion of session 2. So session 3 is about managing risk through adaptation. I'm just going to kick off this piece, and then Kristen is going to take it away. So I have, I think, about 4 slides just to go through, just to kind of get some of the ideas going. The first slide is asking the question, why should we adapt? And so the key point here is that current infrastructure is generally designed based on historical records. And so that assumes that the climate and other factors are stationary. So the climate is changing, as are the likelihood and magnitude of events, and we don't know whether they're getting bigger or smaller or staying the same, but it leads to insufficient resiliency against some hazards. So that's not all hazards, but it certainly there's some hazards. So really the point is that we need to reevaluate acceptable risk. We have to understand what is vulnerable, what is exposed, and what constitutes acceptable risk. So if we look at a flood risk example, and apologies to those that are involved in drought that I'm carrying on with the flood risk theme, but if we have a particular area that is in an area of somewhat acceptable risk at present, and climate change pushes both the likelihood of that event increasing, and at the same time it can increase severity. And I say that because if you think about a flood situation, the depth and velocity within the floodplain might be, the velocity might be faster. So the severity is increased along with the probability of the event. So we can't change the likelihood or the probability of that event occurring, but we can adapt to bring that down once again to an area of acceptable risk. There are many adaptation strategies that apply to flood and drought and all of the other hazards that I listed. So this is just really a very brief idea of some of the adaptation ideas that might exist. So first of all, I want to point out that there are structural and non-structural based approaches to addressing any hazard. And in the case of flood, some examples of structural type of solutions might include diking. And if you build dikes, you have to put pipes through the dikes and you have to put backflow preventers on them. So those are called flood boxes. And the land behind the dike is now unable to drain during flood. So you often have to add a pump station or pump stations. Other things we can do, we can divert water to reduce the flows on the stream. We can store water to attenuate the flows on the stream. So those are all methods of the structural methods for flood mitigation. The non-structural approaches tend to fall in the policy realm. So we could introduce floodplain bylaws that limit or restrict development in floodplains. We can introduce some policy or regulations such as wetland protection, or we can implement strategies such as managed retreat, which is to get the vulnerable assets out of harm's way. And so they tend to be policy regulation based types of decisions. On the drought side of the equation, there's sort of a parallel structural and non-structural, kind of aligns with supply management and demand management. So on the supply management side of things, we can look at storing of water. We can look at diverting water to a location where it's needed. We can implement irrigation networks or irrigation systems to supply water where soil moisture deficits occur. And then sort of the aligned with non-structural is the demand management side of things, which can look, it's really more about local practices when we talk about demand management. So we can be using lower water use sprinklers or irrigation systems that monitor the soil moisture closely so that there's no excess water applied for irrigation. In municipal settings, we can regulate or introduce the need for low volume fixtures. And on the policy side, you can implement water use restrictions. So these are just some ideas just to kind of think about structural and non-structural types of solutions for different water management activities. I think this is quite an important slide to kind of frame how watershed management activities should be looked at. So structural solutions are sometimes necessary to provide resilient systems. This is something we can't get away from. It's absolutely necessary. But the non-structural, the policy and soft engineering solutions typically provide superior value. So as a general rule and in order of preference, the most cost-effective means to mitigate flood and drought hazard is as follows. It's to retain what you have, to restore what you've lost, and to build what you must. And so that's the segue for Kristen, because I think the next slide is yours.
All right, thanks very much. So I'm going to talk about watershed resilience as a means of adaptation, and specifically focus in on some of these natural assets as well as the nature-based solutions. And I think we can all agree here that watershed health is inextricably linked to issues we see around flooding and drought. This relates very much to the hydrological cycle that we looked at earlier, but I like this diagram because it helps to point out the fact that that these natural assets such as wetlands, floodplains, forests all have a significant role in the water cycle. And as we see development occur in our watershed, greater impervious surfaces mean higher runoff volumes, higher peak flows in our rivers. When we look at managing those issues with natural assets, it's easy to see how that can occur in this landscape. Trees have a significant role in reducing stormwater runoff, and that's because their roots act like pipelines down into the soil. It has the ability to promote infiltration and percolation into the deeper groundwater system. The canopy on trees also intercepts precipitation, reducing erosion, but we see a great deal of infiltration change over to surface runoff when we see tree removal. So in fact, there are jurisdictions in North America that have required a certain number of trees be planted as, based on a number of parking spaces that are going to be developed. just to offset that issue. So we've definitely seen a huge shift in how stormwater management practices have evolved. The original or more historic means of dealing with it is getting water into a pipe, getting it from point A to point B as quickly as possible, so we can discharge into a water course or a lake. And now the sustainable practices are looking a lot more at how water can spread out and get back into the ground. And so trees and wetlands have a significant role in that. So I'm really going to focus on trees and wetlands as I talk about some of the nature-based solutions that we're seeing on the ground. And again, wetlands, they do provide a place for water to spread out and slow down, and they are the focus of groundwater recharge, which is key to mitigating drought issues, allowing water to get back into, to replenish groundwater essentially, which so many Albertans rely on. We look at humid landscape, it's possible that you'd have a higher likelihood of groundwater recharge in upland areas. You have enough frequency of precipitation events and potentially lower evapotranspiration. So you may see some groundwater recharge happening in uplands, but for us here in a subhumid landscape, wetlands are the focus of groundwater recharge. And so retaining those and restoring those is key. And I'm not here to tell you that every wetland functions to do groundwater recharge. That's not true. It really depends on the wetland and the underlying geological material. But for us here in Alberta, wetlands are critical for that process to occur. So when I think about adaptation, a couple of concepts I wanted to talk about quickly is about adaptive capacity. So that's not our goodness to fit to some perceived threat, but it's really our flexibility in the face of the unexpected. Climate change mitigation is sort of a mitigative act. It's to reverse a root cause. So greenhouse gases are causing climate change. We can reduce that. But really this presentation is going to talk about resilience as a kind of adaptation. And I like to define resilience as the ability to absorb an impact, but maintain a function. When we think about a healthy ecosystem, like this photograph on the left, that's a floodplain associated with White Mud Creek in Edmonton. And a healthy ecosystem is a resilient ecosystem. And so when we think about opportunities to manage impacts from flooding, for example, this is a key approach to looking at how we can treat severely degraded landscapes to be more resilient to flooding. So this picture on the left, healthy river is basically just long enough, just deep enough, just wide enough to handle all the water and ice and debris and sediment that's going to be produced by its watershed. And as alterations occur in the watershed, specifically within the river corridor, the channel is going to go through the channel adjustment process. And that could stay in that sort of a transition period of channel adjustment for a very long time, depending on the intensity or how long these impacts are occurring. But the point is this, is while that channel adjustment process is underway, these systems are highly susceptible to impacts from a flood. And, studies have actually shown that losses related to flooding is oftentimes more significantly linked to stability problems rather than losses from inundation. So this opens up the concept that we can be more resilient, we can adapt to increase risk of flood by building stability into these systems. Historically, river managers focus very much on trying to contain the water in that channel, trying to develop systems to resist the forces of its flow. And so the shift is now stepping back and allowing that system to be stable and be healthy. Picture on the right here is a lot more common, unfortunately, in urban areas. And what you're seeing in the picture is that there's been a recent slump in this bank. And there's 3 factors happening here that's really making that not a big surprise. First of all, we're on the outside bend of the creek. That's where higher flow velocities exist. We have toe erosion or undercutting of the banks that will lead eventually to slumping of the bank material. The riparian vegetation has been removed. Woody riparian vegetation plays a huge role in building stability into these systems because the root systems have greater depth and diversity and improve the shear strength of those soils, in contrast to grasses with shallow roots. The above ground parts of those woody vegetation stems help to slow flow velocities when water levels are high. And as well, they have a huge capacity to resist impacts from fire. Riparian vegetation, things like willows, poplars, they have a high water content. So in contrast to grasses, which would burn quickly, these can also resist fire and bounce back quickly through natural processes after a fire. But the third factor that's happening here, I mentioned the toe erosion, the outside bend, the undercutting, the riparian vegetation removed. But the third factor here is we have development right up pretty much to the top of that bank, increasing the amount of surface water runoff coming over that slope. And so when we see these 3 things come together, and it's kind of like clockwork, no matter where you go, when these 3 factors are working together, this is what the banks look like. This is a picture of a creek bank. It's at the outside bend. There's a trail placed along the edge of the creek, causing the woody vegetation to be removed, and also creating more surface flow from the surface. And so the resulting condition is an oversteepened slope. The bank material sloughed, and ultimately the river washed the bank material away, and what you have left behind is an oversteepened slope. So we have a lot of opportunities to find these areas throughout our cities, throughout our rural areas, and to restore them and gain that natural capital back and improve our resilience to flooding events. And the simple and low cost techniques here are basically developed by mimicking what Mother Nature's doing. And a lot of natural disasters following some sort of event, natural processes kick in and natural recovery happens. We can see that after volcanoes, avalanches, earthquakes all over the world. But when we're in a system that is out of balance or where there's a lot of disturbance, we need to step in and sort of kickstart that processes. But we can come up with very simple techniques, essentially by using the principles of ecological restoration, looking for filters to recovery, and removing those filters. So in this case, a filter to recovery is an oversteepened slope that resulted from a slump. So what can we do to create a condition where vegetation, the native woody riparian vegetation, can naturally regrow? And my point is this is not enough money in the West to fix all the places that look like this, unless we do start combining some of these nature-based solutions into our toolbox to fix and build stability back into these systems. This is a picture of the fire breaks after the Fort McMurray wildfires. And again, the filter to recovery here is the soil compaction. So we can simply alleviate soil compaction through the use of heavy equipment, excavators, and trees will grow back. We can also go and plant lots of trees, but what we find is on many of our sites, just by eliminating soil compaction, that natural seed rain will come in. The aspen, the poplar, all those trees along those river valley slopes in Fort McMurray will rain in, and eventually you'll have a forest there as long as those filters of recovery are eliminated. This is another filter, which is dense weed growth, very common in a lot of our developed areas. And again, the natural processes that involve seed rain and suckering of these native woody riparian species is going to be thwarted by the fact that there's so much weed growth, and these are agronomic grasses that form a really dense sod. So there's going to be all the seed rain in the world, and nothing's going to be able to establish there. So, oftentimes we have a simple choice between also having a very good view of a lake or a river, or having a stable slope or stable lake shore. And so again, we can look at these situations, and of course we have a long way to go in terms of education and communication. We'll touch on some more later, but there are some very simple things we can do to create conditions for the stability to be returned to these systems by basically using natural processes and mimicking Mother Nature. So the first one I'm going to talk about is soil bioengineering, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about wetland restoration. And soil bioengineering is essentially creating those resilient ecosystems that can absorb the impact and maintain the function. Sensitive areas where trees are removed are highly susceptible to erosion and slumping. And so by restoring the native woody riparian vegetation, we can regain that stability function in those ecosystems. And it's basically the concept of using plants to perform an engineering function or a stability function. Because again, those root systems provide strength to the soil. The dense woody vegetation in periods of high flow will slow flow velocities. They're self-healing and self-sustaining. So if a major storm event cuts off all the tops, or ice flows cut off all the tops, they'll just grow back, oftentimes twice as thick. They're lower cost, they can be installed by hand, and they have all kinds of other benefits like the ability to provide carbon sequestration, biodiversity support, and habitat functions. So I'm going to take us through a few examples. And the first one is a reservoir. There's a major slump upslope of the reservoir. And in fact, what's happening at the top of the slope is there was a reclaimed gravel pit. And the way these things were reclaimed back in the day is you just smooth it out, seed it with grasses and legumes, but creates a condition for a great deal of surface water runoff over the slope. And that ultimately led to the slump. So there was a conventional treatment that was proposed for the slope, which was to cut it back to a 2-to-1 slope and armor it with riprap. The approach that was taken here, again, was a nature-based solution, and we used a treatment called live staking with balsam poplar. And what you can see here are live stakes that were 2 meters long, placed 1 meter in the ground. And they just look like sticks at this point because they were just harvested, the side branches trimmed off, and then placed in the ground. But within a few weeks of the soil warming up in the spring, root systems start to grow. And within a single growing season, the root systems can be totally interlocked. So extending a whole meter down below the ground surface are a dense network of roots, improving the stability of the soil. This particular project costed about $40,000 to complete. And that's in contrast to, again, the conventional design option that was over $1 million to complete. This is the same site, just the same growing season. So you can see how quickly the trees grow and the above ground parts. In addition, one of the workers leaving the site accidentally slipped and grabbed a tree after the end of their installation period in the spring, and was just pretty blown away about how significant root growth was present on these stems. So very good approach, and that's the same growing season as well. This next slide is again looking at the post-wildfire erosion and drainage issues in Fort McMurray from the 2016 wildfires, and some of the conditions that we found on some sites included this sort of rill and gully erosion. And so a very similar approach was taken to deal with this erosion issue. The soil was made rough and loose with an excavator bucket. So you can see there's a series of pits and mounds, and live cuttings were installed. Unlike the last site where they were placed in the ground 9 per square meter, this site was 1 per square meter. And so this is the same growing season as installation. And this is a picture that was just taken a few weeks ago. And so you can see we're putting a forest back, getting that infiltration, less runoff, a very steep slope and a very long slope, but we were able to stabilize using these techniques. Next treatment here is dense live toe staking. So again, this is focusing on dealing with that erosion around the toe zone, the undercutting, the outside bends. This is a very flashy creek. The bridge you can see in the pictures underwater last spring. And ultimately, we're looking at, again, mimicking Mother Nature. If you look at most of our rivers, our healthy streams, they have dense woody riparian vegetation. And we can recreate that, again, by putting willow stakes in the ground. These are 1 meter stakes going 80 centimeters in the ground, creating that really dense network of roots, but big function here, and this is really focusing on treating the cause, which is high flows, the cause of the erosion issues and slumping on these banks, is putting a very dense network. We're looking at about 45 stakes per square meter. That is very effective at slowing down the flow velocities, because it's those flow velocities that are ultimately creating the issues for this trail system. And that's the same site in the same growing season. And if you were to go out there today, the willows are actually over your head. They've gotten to be quite thick and dense, providing a significant amount of stability to the system. This is actually the same creek system, a little overhang, and also a place where undercutting occurred, place that would likely never stabilize on its own. So creating conditions for that native woody riparian vegetation with similar treatments in terms of the staking on the toe zone. But we also built a small wattle fence, so building little mini retaining walls out of willow cuttings. That's basically by putting fence posts and then some horizontal stakes behind them and pulling some soil down from the upper bank, and you can create these sort of stair steps or retaining walls. But again, we're just creating a condition for the native woody riparian vegetation to grow. That's the same site later in the growing season. Again, if you went there today, you wouldn't even be able to tell that we were there. And they say a good bioengineering system is one that you really can't tell we were there. So we also can look at another treatment here quickly, which is the concept of dealing with erosion in channels. And the constructed channels is a picture of a silt fence being installed to help slow flows. So this is two different than using check structures as a way of dealing with channel erosion. The soil bioengineering approach shown here is use of willow cuttings to help slow down those flows. This is what we call a live silt fence. And the cuttings are installed perpendicular to flow in bands. And a little bit of a close up here, you can see I have 3 rows of cuttings, each of the 3 rows of cuttings forming one live silt fence, and the cutting spacing being about 4 centimeters apart. And very significant ability to slow down flows. The willows grow up. You can have a willowy wetland, and it allows sediment to drop out, reducing all of this work in terms of culvert replacement and roads washing out as a result of the higher flows. So next I'm going to talk about wetland restoration. So wetland restoration, again, has a huge role in our watershed management and mitigating impacts of flooding and drought. First of all, wetlands provide temporary storage. It provides a place for water to spread out and slow down. As those wetland basins are removed from the landscape, instead of spreading out and slowing down and percolating back into the ground, we have higher volumes and velocity of runoff, higher peak flows in our rivers, and more significant flooding issues. Wetlands, as I mentioned earlier, also are a focus of groundwater recharge, so have that ability to recharge and replenish groundwater supplies. Also provide a source of hay during periods of drought, and really important refugia for aquatic organisms during periods of drought. So that's critical in terms of a food source for wildlife, supporting biodiversity, and so on and so forth down the line. I'm going to show some examples of wetland restoration now. This is an example of a floodplain wetland that was restored. And just like we talked about, giving water a place to spread out and slow down, that occurs anywhere on the watershed from the top to the bottom. But it's very obvious when you look at a wetland having access to a floodplain like you can see in this photo. I actually took that picture from a helicopter, and you could really see during the spring flow period, the water entering the wetland area and spreading out. This was a very expensive restoration project simply because it involved removing significant amounts of fill. So a few $100,000 in that order to restore this wetland, but the ability to deal with flooding and erosion issues in this particular community, certainly this is a very beneficial project. The next example here is showing an example of restoring a wetland by disabling a ditch. So the photo that you can see on the left, actually, if you were to review old imagery, you'd see that through the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, this was a permanent water body. It was really never dried out. And you can see the drainage ditches show up in the early 90s and sort of get deeper and deeper and eventually there was never any water being held in this wetland. The disabling of the ditch is basically done through a couple of days of work. So more in the $30,000 versus the $300,000 magnitude that we saw in the last photo. And these opportunities are all over the landscape. It's a question of how to reach people to get them in place. Actually, this is a picture of a project in Strathcona County, Alberta. And both this project and a project a mile south of there, we restored wetlands just like this in about 3 days of work. And they were both voluntary landowner projects. So interestingly, there are plenty of landowners who would rather see watch birds and see a healthy wetland than a section of their land that can't grow crops. But these are pretty significant opportunities to restore large areas of wetland with very few dollars, simply by disabling the drainage ditch. So the drainage ditch is coming out of the bottom of the wetland in the photo. Essentially that's done through a fairly simple process by excavating a core trench. We would do this at where we would determine the original rim of the wetland to be before the farmer punched through that rim. We excavate the core trench, removing any permeable material, topsoil, sand, backfill it with material higher in clay, which we borrowed from the adjacent field, and then bring it right back up to match the elevation on the landscape on both sides. So it really is restoring the natural rim of the wetland. We're not talking about building a dam or a dike or something that might need maintenance like a structure. It's just restoring that natural rim. And then the ditch behind us, we were able to smooth that out, like the photo in the bottom left, create a variety of deep pools throughout the wetland, like the photo in the bottom right, and create a lot of different water elevations in the wetland for species diversity. So just 2 or 3 days of work for these projects. And then you could see that following the project, the photo on the right was actually the spring following the construction, and the water levels were restored, and without a single bit of planting, the wetland went from being covered in agronomic weeds to being covered in native wetland plants that were just waiting for their hydrology to be returned. There's just a few more quick examples here. This particular project was conducted actually under the Provincial Wetland Replacement Program, whereby Alberta Environment and Parks is partnering with municipalities. So this particular project was undertaken near Grand Cache, near Victor Lake. And so it was an example where there was a lot of surface water runoff, including runoff from the hamlet of Grand Cache, moving through a utility corridor and into Victor Lake, which is a drinking water source for Grand Cache and a lot of surrounding communities. We were able to reestablish a basin there, allow a place for water to spread out, slow down, and ultimately recharge the groundwater, and also limit the risk of contaminants entering Victor Lake, which is a drinking water source. So this is a kind of project that we're able to create a half a hectare wetland in just about a week of work. Also creating wetlands around storm ponds is something that is a growing trend and also a huge opportunity. Just like this project in Claresholm, the project included great areas of wetlands. Unfortunately, we usually have these major restrictions in space, but in this particular case, they were able to make lots of room for wetlands to be built around the storm ponds. And so a huge difference in flooding effects since this project was installed. And of course, creating wetlands around dugouts. This is just a matter of a day, taking an excavator and creating areas of shallow water, peninsulas, bays, tufts, mounds, installing woody debris. You know, and I stopped and thought maybe I shouldn't talk about this slide because how does it relate to flooding and drought? It's just a dugout. But actually, this particular project was one of the projects in the wetland restoration course. Each time we run the course, we build a wetland with the students so they get the hands-on experience. And it happens to also be located in a very popular nature reserve where there's hiking trails. And so the opportunity to show people that building wetlands is something that you and I can do and the sort of ability to get that airtime was, and again, going back to that concept of sharing information, communication, education, collaboration across the watersheds, to get people to come together a little bit more frequently, and realize that these projects are things that we can undertake as communities without much trouble. So this project, I think, had a lot of benefit in terms of resilience through education. And then lastly, this is a picture of taking a farm field and establishing a series of basins. This was also a project under the provincial wetland replacement program with the municipality, where we were able to go into some farmers' properties who really wanted to do something good for the environment and let us reestablish these wetland basins, which are these shallow, temporary and seasonal wetlands that unfortunately were the easiest ones to remove and are quite rare in many agricultural landscapes. And so we were able to build about 16 of these in a couple of weeks. So policy has a big role in how we can make a shift towards some of these nature-based solutions. Going back to John's point in terms of retaining what we have, restoring what we can, and building what we must. Our policy has a big role in our ability to be able to achieve those things. This probably is a topic could deserve an entire day, but I just wanted to briefly touch on some of the key ones that do relate to these items. And first of all is our wetland policy. In Alberta, we're leaps and bounds beyond a lot of our neighboring provinces in terms of having a great wetland policy. What it's there to do is regulate wetland loss, and to require proponents to compensate when they remove wetlands for the landscape. That usually is a monetary payment. That payment goes in to a pot, and that pot is spent by people to replace the wetlands. Are there limitations? Absolutely. There's still not a lot that can be done to remove some wetlands in important areas. It's not a no net loss policy. It's a managed loss policy. So we still do lose important wetlands. The amount of funds collected is a little bit less than $20,000 a hectare. So the kinds of replacement projects and the extent of replacement projects will always be limited by that low dollar amount, and so on. But like I say, we have a very effective policy in place that does help us to manage these natural assets, which are wetlands. And then, of course, the Fisheries Act. The Fisheries Act is there to protect and conserve and enhance fisheries habitat and their ecosystems that support fish. So we have opportunities to reduce riparian impacts and compensate and offset them through restoration projects. Floodplain development, of course, is something that we're seeing growing protection over in terms of the mapping of flood hazard areas and the limitations on development that's allowed to happen in those flood hazard areas. So those are the floodways and the flood fringes. And so, again, limitations there, as well as certainly a number of developments that have taken place historically in some of those floodplains, and maintain some level of risk for us. But again, that's another area where we're able to manage these impacts and these risks. And then lastly, riparian buffers. And I wanted to put this in, briefly talk about the importance of the municipal policy and bylaws with relationship to all of these things. There are some things that really do fall on the hands of the municipalities, and in some cases they're fairly limited in how much they can do. That could be political pressure, and so on. But with that photo I showed you of a lake lot with a choice between a view and a stable lakeshore, that particular municipality has also been working hard to get some policies limiting the ability for landowners to clear trees around the lake. But there's so much opposing pressure to that, because people have money, they have great views, and there's places where there's going to be enough political pressure, it's going to become difficult for municipalities to put some of those practices in place. But again, this is a very powerful tool that is in the hands of municipalities in terms of local policies and bylaws. So key messages I wanted to touch on: wetlands and riparian vegetation are natural assets. They do improve watershed resilience. the degraded systems are very susceptible to impacts related to flooding and drought, and create a huge opportunity for us as watershed managers to identify and restore these key areas. And again, it's important that we retain what we have, restore what we've lost, and build only what we must. So
our poll for this time is adaptation strategies to reduce the impacts of various hazards take many forms. We're wondering what you folks think are the most effective adaptation approaches.
So the next session is assessing the value of adaptation strategies. As I said before, I'll carry on with a flooding example, but I really hope that we can kind of see how with modifications, tweaking, we might be able to apply similar types of approaches to other adaptation strategies. And it was sort of interesting just in the Q&A when we one of the final questions had to do with prioritization, valuing the value, or putting value on the adaptation strategies, including restoration and retention of wetlands. So it would be interesting to consider whether the approaches I'm going to talk about now could be applied in that way. And I think they likely could, but it would it requires some thought as well. So carrying on with the flooding example, the same image that we saw before of the Bow River and the inundation area, start thinking about adaptation. There are many things we can do, both structural and non-structural. So for example, on the structural side, very likely the first idea that might come to mind is to construct a diking system. And that's true. And with that diking system, we'd have to determine the dike alignment. So I've indicated that one of the options would be, let's evaluate the effectiveness and value of a diking system, but let's determine the alignment and what impact it's going to have on the landscape and private and public property and transportation corridors and what have you. So we probably wouldn't just look at one dike alignment. We'd probably look at a number of different dike alignment options. And there's lots of other structural options as well. So I've just indicated that as option X, but I just want to focus on dike alignment for the moment. And on the non-structural side, we could do nothing. That is a perfectly valid option. But doing nothing is going to result in the cost of inaction. There is a cost associated with that, which is going to be the losses associated with that, with doing nothing. Other non-structural approaches, whether it's practical or not, managed retreat would be an option, but that would mean depopulating the areas that would be in harm's way, relocating those people and the infrastructure. So whether it's practical or not, that's a different question, but it's one of the non-structural options that could be considered. Once again, there's other options, but for illustrative purposes, I'm just indicating a few prime options that might be considered. We saw this slide before, and the blue dot was referred to as the losses. That was the area that was inundated, multiplied by the consequence data to come up with a total present value, or a net present value of the total losses of that inundated area. But when we start thinking about adaptation, this blue dot takes on a completely different meaning. Instead of being losses, it is the area that now becomes protected. So it's averted losses. So it's actually the opposite. It becomes your benefits because we've protected that area. Now, instead of being losses, it's benefits associated with the adaptation strategy. And I said here assumes no residual losses. And that's meaning that with many different adaptation strategies, it's not necessarily a perfect solution. For example, there still might be damages even once you implement the adaptation strategy. So in this case, assuming no residual losses, that assumes that the dike is built perfectly, that it's high enough, that it's not going to erode during a flood event, and that it will withstand the design event perfectly. So with that assumption, there are no residual losses. Okay, but with that protection of that area comes a cost, because of course we have to build the dike. And the cost of building the dike, once again for this illustrative example, is around $20 million, but we're protecting over $100 million of averted losses. So the cost benefit associated with this benefit and this cost is quite high. It's higher than a ratio of 5. So the benefit cost is greater than 5. Okay, this is a standards-based approach once again, because this is one solution at a 100-year return period, showing that the benefit that would be achieved if you design to that return period. But that's not really the entire story. So this next slide shows something much more comprehensive. So if you enter this slide and say, okay, with the standards-based approach, we had a benefit of a certain value, which is represented by the green line. So just over $100 million in averted damages at a 100-year return period. And the cost at that point was in the order of $20 million. But if we say, okay, let's look at a range of return periods. Let's look at the complete spectrum. So if you follow the green curve, you'll see that it starts, say, at something like a 50-year return period and extends out over a whole range of return periods up to 1,000 years. Okay, but to build a perfect dike system so that you get the full benefit of the averted damages, you also have to build your dike higher and higher. And so that's represented by the red line. So the green line is the benefits and the averted losses, and the red line is the cost associated with providing a higher and higher level of flood protection as you implement or as you protect against a higher return period. So next, I'd like to draw your attention to the purple line, the highest line, which is the benefit cost curve. And so if you look at the benefit cost curve, it peaks at around a 200-year return period. So if we had built, based on the previous slide, had we built the dike to a 100-year return period design standard, we would have done quite well. We'd be pretty darn close to the maximum benefit cost ratio. But we could have done a little bit better. We could have built it to the 200-year return period and really maximize that benefit cost. Okay, but beyond 200-year return period, you can see the benefit cost starts declining. And so the question would be, is 200-year return period optimum? From a benefit cost perspective, it is. But if you had extra money burning a hole in your pocket and you wanted to invest it wisely, you could look at the blue curve. And what the blue curve is representing the fact that your benefits, the green line, are accruing more quickly than the costs, the red line. So as long as the blue line is increasing, that means for every dollar you spend, you're getting more than $1 in return. So it's pretty good investment. So in that regard, we could start investing beyond the 200-year return period and still expect a good return on investment. And in fact, you could keep on doing that all the way up to about a 500-year return period where the blue line peaks out. And beyond a 500-year return period, for every dollar you spend, you'd get less than $1 return on investment. So based on this, this really tells you a complete story of the level of flood protection you might want to provide. Because what it would tell me is that if you really want to get great bang for your buck, if you really want to get that good return on investment, build the dike to a 200-year return period in this illustrative example. And then as time goes on, and if your flood risk is increasing for various reasons, you could take that additional money and start building up your dike incrementally beyond the 200-year return period, all the way up to the 500-year return period. So it would be a way of smoothing out your cash flow. It would be a way of maintaining a high standard and improving that level of protection over time and making a wise investment. Okay, so that brings us to this slide that illustrates what this might look like. So the horizontal dashed line towards the bottom of the slide shows the standard that would be provided if you have a typical constant design standard and maintenance. That would follow basically that horizontal dashed line. But over time, the non-stationarity impacts that is not just climate change, but other changes in the watershed, including floodplain development and including changing flood hazard from climate change and maybe other impacts. It could be infestations, forest fires, logging activities, and other activities in the watershed. So your flood hazard can also be changing with time as a result of those non-stationary type of impacts. And if you combine the flood hazard and the floodplain development type of impacts, your total flood risk curve continues to increase somewhat exponentially. And that's shown as the total flood risk curve. So based on the economic evaluation I just went through, and based on the fact that your flood risk might be increasing over time, you can see the step function. So once again, the dashed lines that look like steps, which is referred to as risk-based flexible design. So it would basically indicate that, yes, you can do some really important work up front, but think about the future. Think about how you can plan to implement that type of improvement. And in the case of the diking example, one of the things that would be really important is to preserve the footprint area, the dike footprint, so that if you did want to expand it in the future, you had the room to do so. You could plan your utilities, you could plan your infrastructure to allow for where this might go in the future and to allow for considerations of future risk-based flexible design. On the right chart, it shows what this might look like on the risk matrix. So if you start in the arrow, sort of the top center arrow, climate change and other non-stationary impacts might push your risk profile further to the right and further upwards into an area of approaching non-acceptable risk. And so you can do that first step of the adaptation and bring your position to something that's more acceptable from a risk perspective. And that, of course, will occur again through non-stationary impacts, and you can adapt again. So you could just carry on with this risk-based flexible design to make sure that you're always in that acceptable area of the risk curve or the risk matrix table. Okay, and then the key messages from this session include so assessing the value of an adaptation option to improve resilience can be based on a fixed standard. And so that's where we looked at with that single blue dot on the cost curve. But the level of service of a fixed design standard, it will change over time. Due to climate change, but due to other non-stationary factors as well that I mentioned. And I think the important point is that enhanced value can be derived by allowing a flexible level of service, or in other words, allowing the annual exceedance probability design standard to vary. And a risk-based flexible design can maintain or can keep you in that area of appropriate risk for best value. And that is the conclusion of session 4.
So we have been talking about adaptation in terms of structural and non-structural methods, even nature-based solutions. I want to now turn to talking about adaptation as resilience. So resilience meaning the continuation of a desired function through enabling changes in social organization. You know, a simplistic model of communicating climate change is we'll put information out there. Maybe we offer a training course, write books, publish them, allow people to buy them on Amazon. And that assumes that there's people on the receiving end that are going to go and pick that stuff up and run with it. But in today's society, communication is so much more complex and dynamic. And so trying to fit this concept of resilience as adaptation into today's communication is really requires a different approach. And so, you know, these changes that we strive to achieve through resilience it can be facilitated through social learning and self-organization. So we can enable technological evolution, exchange of information, decision-making procedures. But underlying all of this is the fact that people's values, their worldviews, their priorities come into play in all this. So first I want to talk about the social ecological systems framework. And it's based on the theory that ecological systems and social systems are inextricably linked. And so their long-term health is dependent upon change. So our SES is basically this system of people and nature, creating that linkage between these ecological systems and our management practices. So our adaptive capacity is very much tied to our capacity for social learning and self-organization. So what is social learning? Essentially, it's the idea of people coming together and sharing information. It happens when social collectives form and new values, ideas, and practices are shared amongst people, and they eventually become popular. So, you know, a good example of that would be a commercial, and put it out there on TV and people watch that commercial. But I think there are a lot better examples when it comes to adaptation or resilience. Social learning has a role in transitional and transformational adaptation. Now, transitional adaptation is a shift in institutional policy and innovations, where this transformation is a total shift, maybe in power and money, maybe allowing practices to become required or other practices to cease. And so social learning has the ability to affect both of those things. Now, social organization is basically the propensity for a social collective to form. And these could be informal or formal groups. It could be a neighborhood group that decides to go restore a wetland and put lots of signs up about it, or it could be an NGO or a watershed stewardship society. But it's the ability for these groups to form and make change without any direction from a higher organization, without it being a requirement. It just happens. And so it essentially creates an environment for learning, for values to form, and practices to emerge. And what is so, you know, interesting to me, there was some really great questions and profound comments from the audience about the need to educate, the need to engage, have engagement across stakeholders, all stakeholders that are affected in a given watershed. I couldn't agree more. And so how we achieve that is really a big question that as individuals, as societies, as governments have to evolve as things like social media and other platforms become the focus for things like social learning and self-organization. So I think that, for me, I think of what I do in my day-to-day life. I'm an educator and I'm a restoration ecologist. And so one of the activities that I undertake is I do a lot of outreach. I reach out to groups. I ask them if they want to put on local workshops, stream restoration workshops, where we can pull in local community members and stewardship groups, try and learn certain techniques. Maybe they'll go home, tell their friends about it, post pictures on Facebook. This is just one little thing that I've decided that I would do with my time. But I think what is an excellent opportunity today is to find out from the audience as to what experiences you've had and how effective communication has taken place through things like social learning and self-organization. How have you seen these organizations form? How have you seen this communication get out there? How have you seen this collaboration take place in the various experiences that you've had specifically relevant to climate change? So what I would like to do is ask the audience, as we reflect on the role of these two things, social learning and self-organization, what are some of the local examples that you've encountered, or maybe examples that aren't local to Alberta, but that you see as being options for us here in Alberta? And what I hope is an outcome of this discussion or these comments is that we can all inspire each other in the name of social learning. So with that, it takes us to our next polling question. And so I'll hand it back over to you, Sarah.
Yeah, thanks, Kristen. We're just hoping that you could take a minute or two and enter suggestions for effective communication.